The heat of the sun pressed heavily on the land of Israel, scorching the earth and leaving it barren. For months, not a single drop of rain had fallen from the sky. Rivers that once teemed with life had dried up, crops had withered, and the people were gripped with fear and hunger. This was no ordinary drought, it was a judgment from God. During this crisis stood Elijah, a prophet chosen by the Lord to deliver his message. Elijah had boldly confronted King Ahab, a wicked ruler who had led Israel into idolatry by worshiping Baal. Standing in the king's court, Elijah had declared, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." The announcement had infuriated Ahab, and Elijah's life was now in danger. God, knowing this, instructed him to leave immediately. "Elijah," the Lord said, his voice calm and commanding, "leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food." Elijah trusted God completely, even though the instructions seemed strange. Ravens. They were scavengers, creatures that took food, not ones known for giving it. Yet Elijah obeyed, setting out on a journey into the wilderness. The journey to the Kerith ravine was harsh. The sun burned down relentlessly, and the dry wind carried with it the scent of dust and despair. Elijah's sandals kicked up clouds of dirt as he walked through the desolate land, his faith the only thing sustaining him. When he finally arrived at the ravine, he was relieved to find a small brook still flowing with cool, clear water. It was a rare sight in the midst of the drought, a reminder of God's provision. Elijah knelt by the brook, cupping his hands to drink deeply. The refreshing water revived his weary body. As the sun began to set, Elijah sat on a rock, gazing at the golden hues of the sky. His stomach growled, a sharp reminder that he hadn't eaten all day. He looked around the ravine, wondering how God's promise of food would be fulfilled. Just as the first stars appeared in the night sky, Elijah heard the distinct cawing of birds. He looked up to see a flock of ravens flying toward him. His heart quickened. Could this be the provision God had promised? The ravens swooped down, landing a short distance away. Elijah watched in amazement as one of the birds hopped closer, holding a piece of bread in its beak. It dropped the bread at his feet and flew off. Another raven followed, this one carrying a piece of meat. It too dropped its offering before taking flight. Elijah stared at the food, his heart pounding with awe. He knelt to pick it up, examining it closely. The bread was fresh, and the meat was clean. It wasn't the scraps he had expected, but food fit for a meal. "Thank you, Lord," Elijah whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. He ate slowly, savoring every bite. This was no ordinary provision, it was a miracle. The next morning, Elijah awoke to the sound of rustling leaves and the gentle babble of the brook. The cool morning air was a welcome relief from the heat of the previous day. He knelt by the stream to drink, his body refreshed but his mind still buzzing with questions. As if on cue, the ravens returned. Once again they brought bread and meat, dropping their offerings before flying off into the distance. Elijah smiled, his faith growing with each passing moment. Day after day, the ravens came, morning and evening, never failing to provide. At first Elijah was startled by their consistency. How did they know to come? Where did they find the food? But over time, he came to see them as God's messengers, faithful and unyielding in their task. As the days turned into weeks, Elijah grew more at home in the ravine. The brook provided water, The ravens brought food, and the quiet solitude gave him time to reflect and pray. But there were challenges too. One day, as Elijah sat by the brook waiting for the ravens, he heard a low growl. His eyes darted toward the trees where he saw the faint outline of a wild animal, a jackal, its hungry eyes fixed on him. Elijah's heart raced, but he stood his ground, trusting that God would protect him. The jackal crept closer, but before it could pounce, the familiar sound of flapping wings filled the air. The ravens descended, their presence startling the predator. The jackal hesitated, then slinked back into the shadows, defeated. Elijah breathed a sigh of relief, his faith in God's provision and protection growing stronger. Each day in the ravine brought new lessons. Elijah marveled at how God used the least likely creatures, ravens, often seen as unclean and insignificant, to sustain him. Their faithfulness reminded him of God's unending care and the importance of trusting him, even in the most uncertain times. But the drought continued, and Elijah noticed that the brook was beginning to shrink. The once strong flow of water had slowed to a trickle, and the lush greenery around it had started to wither. Elijah knew the brook wouldn't last forever, yet he didn't despair. He trusted that when the time came, God would guide him once again. As he sat by the dwindling stream watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors, Elijah whispered a prayer. "Lord, you are faithful. Thank you for sustaining me here. I will trust you, no matter what comes next." The night fell over the ravine, and Elijah lay down to rest, the soft rustling of the raven's wings still fresh in his mind. Little did he know, his time in the ravine was only the beginning of a journey that would test his faith and reveal God's power in ways he could never have imagined. The Kerith ravine had become Elijah's refuge. Each morning and evening, the ravens faithfully delivered bread and meat, and the brook provided cool water to quench his thirst. The quiet rhythm of life in the ravine allowed Elijah time to pray and reflect, but the prophet couldn't ignore the changes around him. The once steady stream of the brook had slowed to a mere trickle. Elijah crouched by the shrinking pool, scooping water into his hands. The drought was worsening, and even this secluded place was not immune. Still, the ravens came like clockwork, their wings slicing through the sky as they delivered their gifts. Elijah marveled at how God used these unlikely creatures to sustain him, but the dwindling brook stirred questions in his heart. "Lord," he prayed one evening as he watched the sun dip below the horizon, "you have provided for me here, and I am grateful. But what happens when the brook is gone? What will you ask of me next?" The answer didn't come immediately, but Elijah trusted that it would. One morning, Elijah awoke to an unusual silence. The brook, which had once babbled softly through the ravine, was now completely dry. He stared at the cracked bed where water had once flowed, his heart heavy. The ravens, however, still arrived, their black feathers gleaming in the sunlight as they dropped bread and meat before flying away. Elijah ate slowly, savoring the meal and thinking about the drought's relentless grip on the land. He had seen the desperation of the people during his journey to the ravine, fields turned to dust, livestock collapsing from thirst, children crying from hunger. He knew the suffering was a consequence of Israel's rebellion against God, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. As Elijah sat in the quiet ravine, his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of flapping wings. This time, the ravens didn't just bring food. They lingered, perching on nearby rocks and trees as if watching him. Elijah furrowed his brow, sensing that something was different. One raven hopped closer, tilting its head as it studied him. It cawed softly, and Elijah felt a strange sense of reassurance. It was as if the birds, God's unlikely messengers, were telling him not to worry. Days passed, and the ravine grew hotter and drier. Without water, the plants withered, and the air filled with the scent of dust and decay. Yet the ravens continued their mission, never failing to bring food. Their persistence amazed Elijah. One evening, as the last light of the day faded, Elijah noticed a commotion among the ravens. They cawed loudly and circled above him, their movements more frantic than usual. Elijah stood, shielding his eyes as he looked up. Suddenly, one of the birds swooped down, dropping something unusual, a shiny object that clinked against the rocks. Elijah bent to pick it up, finding a small, smooth stone. It was unremarkable at first glance, but as he turned it over in his hand, he noticed markings etched into its surface. "What is this, Lord?" Elijah murmured, holding the stone up to the fading light. Though there was no immediate answer, Elijah felt a stirring in his spirit. The stone wasn't just a random object. It was a sign. He tucked it into his cloak, sensing that it would have significance later. The nights in the ravine grew colder, the once comforting sound of the brook now replaced by an eerie stillness. Elijah wrapped his cloak tightly around himself, lying on the hard ground as he gazed up at the stars. He thought about the ravens, their faithfulness a constant reminder of God's provision. "Even the smallest of your creatures obey you, Lord," Elijah whispered. "Teach me to trust you as they do." One morning, as the sun rose over the barren ravine, Elijah heard the familiar sound of wings. He looked up to see the ravens, but this time they flew in a pattern he hadn't seen before. They circled overhead, cawing loudly, then flew eastward, disappearing into the distance. Elijah watched them go, his heart pounding. He felt an urgency in their departure, as if they were pointing him towards something beyond the ravine. "Is it time, Lord?" Elijah asked aloud. The answer came, clear and unmistakable. "Get up, Elijah. Leave this place and go to Zarephath in Sidon. I have commanded a widow there to supply you with food." Elijah stood, his heart steady despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The ravens had sustained him through the worst of the drought, their faithfulness a testament to God's care. Now he was being sent into unfamiliar territory, to a foreign land where Baal worship was prevalent. A widow, someone with little to give, would be his next source of provision. Elijah packed his few belongings and began the journey. As he left the ravine, he looked back one last time, the memory of the ravens etched in his heart. The journey ahead would be long and challenging. But Elijah walked with confidence, knowing that the same God who had sent the ravens would continue to guide and provide for him. The journey to Zarephath was long and grueling. The hot sun beat down on Elijah as he traveled through the barren wilderness, the land showing no signs of relief from the drought. Fields were dry, wells empty, and villages eerily quiet. Despite the desolation around him, Elijah's heart remained steady. He had seen God's provision in the Kerith ravine, and he trusted that the Lord would sustain him again. As Elijah approached the gates of Zarephath, the town's desolation was clear. The streets were sparsely populated, and the few people he saw had hollow eyes and gaunt faces, their strength sapped by hunger. It was here, in this unlikely place, that God had promised Elijah he would find a widow to provide for him. Near the gates, Elijah spotted a woman bent over gathering sticks. Her clothes were worn, her face pale, and her movement slow with exhaustion. Elijah approached her, his voice calm but firm. "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" he asked. The woman paused, looking up at the stranger. Her lips were dry and cracked, but something in Elijah's voice compelled her to obey. She turned to fetch the water, but as she walked away, Elijah called after her, "And please, bring me a piece of bread." The woman stopped in her tracks. Slowly, she turned back, her face etched with sorrow. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she said, her voice trembling, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Her words struck Elijah deeply. Here was a woman at the edge of despair, yet she was the one God had chosen to sustain him. Elijah took a step closer, his eyes meeting hers. "Don't be afraid," he said gently. "Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have, and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The widow hesitated, doubt flickering in her eyes. Could this man's God truly provide for her when everything else had failed? Taking a deep breath, she turned and walked back to her home, her heart torn between fear and hope. In her small, dimly lit kitchen, the widow poured the last of the flour into a bowl. She tipped the jug, letting the last few drops of oil drip into the mixture. Her son watched silently from the corner, his wide eyes reflecting his hunger. She shaped the dough into a small loaf and placed it in the fire. As the bread baked, the aroma filled the room, but her heart was heavy. This was the last of her food. If this man's promise wasn't true, she and her son wouldn't survive another day. When the bread was ready, she carried it outside and handed it to Elijah. The prophet took the loaf with a grateful nod, then sat down to eat. The widow returned to her kitchen, preparing to face the worst, but as she reached for the jar of flour, she gasped. The jar, which had been empty moments ago, was now full. She lifted the jug of oil. It too was brimming. Tears filled her eyes as she realized the truth. The prophet's words had come to pass. God had provided. From that day on, the jar of flour and the jug of oil never ran out. Each morning and evening, the widow prepared meals for Elijah, herself, and her son, marveling at the unending supply. Her home, once filled with despair, was now a place of hope and gratitude. Elijah stayed with the widow, finding shelter in her humble home. Each day, as the flour and oil replenished themselves, his faith in God's provision grew stronger. The ravens had fed him in the ravine, and now God had used a widow to sustain him in a foreign land. One afternoon, as Elijah prayed in his room, he heard a commotion downstairs. Rushing down, he found the widow cradling her son, who lay limp in her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she cried out, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Elijah's heart broke at her words. Taking the boy from her arms, he carried him to the upper room and laid him on the bed. Then he knelt beside the child, his voice rising in a desperate prayer. "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Elijah cried. He stretched himself out over the boy 3 times, pleading with God, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The room was still, the air heavy with the weight of Elijah's prayer. Suddenly the boy's chest rose. He gasped for air, his eyes fluttering open. Elijah lifted him, his heart swelling with gratitude. Carrying the boy downstairs, Elijah placed him in his mother's arms. "Look," Elijah said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Your son is alive." The widow stared at her son, tears streaming down her face. She looked at Elijah, her voice trembling with awe. "Now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." As days turned into weeks, Elijah remained with the widow and her son in Zarephath. The miraculous provision of flour and oil continued, a daily reminder of God's unwavering care. Each morning, as the widow prepared bread, she marveled at the abundance in her kitchen. The boy, once pale and weak, now laughed and played, his energy restored. But Elijah's journey was far from over. The drought still gripped the land, and the people of Israel continued to suffer. Elijah often gazed out of the small window of the widow's home, his mind heavy with the burden of his calling. The lessons of the ravens and the widow's jar of flour had strengthened his faith, but he knew greater challenges lay ahead. One evening, as the stars dotted the dark sky, Elijah sat with the widow and her son by the fire. The boy, curious and full of life, turned to Elijah with wide eyes. "Prophet, why does God send ravens to feed you? Couldn't he have done something bigger?" Elijah chuckled softly, the firelight dancing across his weathered face. "Ah, little one," he said, "sometimes God uses the smallest and most unexpected things to show his greatness. The ravens reminded me that nothing is too insignificant for God to use. And you see, he didn't just save me. He used the ravens to prepare me to trust him for even greater things." The boy frowned thoughtfully, then smiled. "Like Mama's flour and oil?" "Exactly," Elijah said, his eyes twinkling. "God's provision teaches us to trust him, even when we don't understand how or why." That night, Elijah lay awake, listening to the soft breathing of the widow and her son. His mind returned to the ravens, their faithful deliveries in the wilderness. He remembered the lessons of patience and trust that they had taught him. The drought had tested not only the land but also his spirit. Yet through it all, God had never abandoned him. As the first rays of dawn crept through the window, Elijah rose and went outside. The town of Zarephath was quiet, the streets still shrouded in shadows. Elijah knelt on the dry ground and prayed, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Lord, you have shown me your faithfulness in the smallest of ways. You sent the ravens to feed me, and you led me to this widow who has also witnessed your power. Strengthen me for what lies ahead, and let your will be done in this land." The drought showed no signs of ending, but Elijah's spirit was now unshakable. He had seen God work through the most unlikely means, through birds, through a widow, and through a simple jar of flour and jug of oil. These miracles weren't just about survival. They were a testament to God's intimate care and power. One afternoon, as Elijah sat under the shade of a tree outside the widow's home, the Lord's voice came to him again. "Elijah, the time has come. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." Elijah stood, his heart steady and his resolve firm. The drought had been a time of preparation, a test of faith, not just for the people of Israel, but for him as well. Now, God was calling him to return to Israel, to face King Ahab once more, and to declare the end of the drought. Elijah turned to the widow and her son, gratitude filling his heart. "I must go now," he said, his voice gentle. "The Lord has called me back to Israel." The widow's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "Go with our blessings, prophet. You've brought us hope and shown us the power of your God. We will never forget you." The boy hugged Elijah tightly, his small arms wrapping around the prophet's waist. "Will you come back?" he asked, his voice tinged with sadness. Elijah knelt, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "The Lord's plans are greater than mine, little one, but wherever I go, I will carry your faith with me." As Elijah walked away from Zarephath, the memories of the ravens and the widow filled his mind. They had been instruments of God's provision, teaching him to trust and preparing him for the battles ahead. The journey back to Israel was long, but Elijah's heart was light. He knew that just as the ravens had fed him in the wilderness and the widow had sustained him in her home, God would continue to guide and provide for him. The drought was about to end, but the lessons of faith, trust, and obedience would stay with Elijah forever.